Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Following the Beijing-brokered resumption of Saudi-Iran relations, more Middle East countries are in the process of reviving diplomatic ties with their regional rivals. How are the political and economic landscapes of the Middle East shifting with the recent wave of diplomatic reconciliations? How did China become a successful peacemaker in the region? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Professor Wang Jin from Northwest University of China, Professor Foad Izadi of the University of Tehran in Iran, and Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, long-term rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia, have recently restored their ties after 7 years. Qatar and Bahrain, Qatar and UAE, Syria and Tunisia are also expected to resume their ties very soon. So, Professor Izadi, could you explain to our audience, the importance, the significance of this process of detente and reconciliation?
Yes, I think the agreement is quite significant for three reasons at three levels. On bilateral relations, both Saudi Arabia and Iran are two major countries in this part of the world. They are neighbors. They have been neighbors for centuries. This kind of animosity that existed for decades needed to end. And it's good news that the Saudi government decided to change course. For the last number of years and decades, the Saudi government's policy on Iran was hostile. It seems they realized that that policy was not paying off. So on bilateral relations, I think it's quite important and good for both countries. There is a second level. The regional issues are also affected by both Saudi and Iranian foreign policy. And if there is peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, you're going to have peace in many parts of the Middle East. You already see that the relations between Saudi Arabia and Syria is improving. With regard to Yemen, we had a delegation from Saudi Arabia going to Yemen. The war in Yemen that has devastated that country seems to be ending soon. That's at least what we are hoping. So at regional level, I think things are looking good. And on international level, this is a huge humiliation for the United States. The fact that the Chinese government managed to do this is quite significant. United States is a country in decline. And the Chinese government has shown that they are not only are good at business, they're also good at diplomacy. And so this is significant for China, Iran-Chinese relations as well. And overall, if you have peace in the Middle East, internationally, that's going to have good results. So I think we have a win-win situation, and the Chinese government needs to be thanked for having this initiative and staying with the process and succeeding at it as we speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, as said by Mr. Izadi, China was instrumental in brokering this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has been the major headline stories around the world for some time. So tell us, why was China suitable for the mediator role?
Let me start with Samuel Huntington, who famously wrote that civilizations clash. And what China has shown is that three of the most influential civilizations in the history of mankind, the Chinese civilization, the Arabic civilization, and the Persian Iranian civilization, have shown that they don't have to clash, that they can work together, they can harmonize and cooperate. And I think one of the important reasons for this is multifaceted. So China is trusted and respected, and the reason it is trusted and respected is that it treats others with trust and with respect. Respect for sovereignty, respect for not interfering with the domestic affairs of other countries. And there's the economic factor as well. So we know that China's had a historic economic miracle of the last few decades that has not only benefited China and the people of China, but many countries around the world, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I think that gives China a certain amount of influence, and it gives people a willingness to listen to what China has to say.
Mr. Izadi, China has maintained strong ties with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. We know that China has a cooperation agreement of 25 years, with Iran, and of course, China is the largest basic destination for Saudi Arabia's export of oil and related products. So, being the largest trading partner for both countries, does that somehow enable China to play a very important role in bringing the two countries together, Mr. Izadi?
Yes, I think given the fact that both Iran and Saudi Arabia have good relations with China, it was a factor. That's one reason the United States couldn't do what China did, because the United States has been hostile to Iran for many decades. So that economic linkage and economic cooperation between the Chinese government and Iran and Saudi Arabia is significant. But I think what is probably more significant is the fact that China doesn't have a history of colonialism in the Middle East. China doesn't have a history of aggression towards the people of this part of the world. China does not try to force its views on other countries. China has shown that is actually ready to play a major role internationally because the way China does foreign policy. And you can appreciate that when you compare that to what the Western governments engage in, what they're doing in Europe, what they're doing in Africa, in South America. So overall, I think the economic issues are important, but more important are the political issues, cultural factors that have resulted in both Saudi Arabia and Iran realizing that if they want to make up, Beijing would be the place to do it.
Mr. Izadi, you mentioned about China having no historical burdens for colonialism. So does that mean like China is welcomed by both countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, probably by the regional countries, since China maintained a very good relationship basically with every country in the region?
Yes, we live in Asia. The continent is Asia. And if there are difficulties among Asian countries, whether they're in West Asia or East Asia or wherever, Asians can manage to resolve their issues without interference from the West. Because the experience of our people, at least, has been whenever Westerners get involved, they manage to mess up whatever they are engaging in. And they have attacked countries in this part of the world. They have occupied countries in this part of the world. They have obviously humiliated themselves with the way they ran away from Afghanistan, and the policies of the United States have been a total failure in this part of the world. But the memory of aggression and memory of murder and occupation is quite alive. And that's why the United States could not be trusted. And I think that's one of the reasons the Saudi government changed its foreign policy. They realized that United States is a power in decline. They realized that putting all their eggs in US basket is not a good idea. And they, given the fact that they have good relations with China, including economic relations, they realized that they need to move on. Whatever happened after World War II, whatever agreement Saudi Arabia and United States had after World War II was 70, 80 years ago. So it's time to move on. It's time to realize that we are moving towards a multipolar world. And it's good reason. It's good that we are moving towards a multipolar world, because in a multipolar world, countries like China can play an important role, and that's good for everybody.
Professor Wang Jin, China has maintained ties with basically every country in the region, and also China is striking a delicate balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And China, of course, is not pursuing, a so-called divide and control probably, or siding with one party against the other. Instead, China is pursuing, peace, and beyond that, development. So that's the priority for the Chinese domestically. And also, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, also internationally. So, probably because of that, China is in a better place, let's say, than some other big powers to mediate peace and to bring countries together, to talk to each other, to seek dialogue instead of rivalry.
Yes, you are right. I think China's the strategy or China's foreign policy philosophy is totally different from other global powers, or especially from those traditionally the Western powers. Because China, as you mentioned, we respect every regional countries, and we want to develop ties with every regional countries with equal status. And we do not want to establish the kind of the relations based upon the humiliation, based upon this kind of the upper or level, the different the stances. So we just want to develop ties based on dignity, based on respect, based upon the equal standards. So China was the very countries who suffered the humiliation from some colonialism and the imperialism. So we knew, and we still remember the feeling of being suffered or the being humiliated. So that's why we don't want this feeling to be copied into the regional countries. So that is why I think on the one hand, the histories, especially the very shared humiliation history that could bring the China and the regional country together. And on the other hand, China's diplomatic philosophy is totally different from other global powers. Especially China knows that the win-win situation should be the only principle for the developing ties with the regional countries, because when we're talking about win-win, it means this relation will be sustainable. And this kind of relation, the cooperation will be there keeping for a much longer time than just than the relation that based upon the humiliation and the unilateralism. So I think China's brings here the regional affairs or the other global affairs a very, very totally different new diplomatic philosophy that is equal, that is respect, and that is win-win prospect.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, earlier, I think, both you and Wang Jin mentioned about the Chinese philosophy, the Chinese culture, and also the Chinese diplomatic principles. Speak of that, China proposed the Global Security Initiative last year, advocating the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. So is China putting such an initiative into practice by helping reach the reconciliation, between Saudis and the Iranis here?
Absolutely is, Qingduo. So, many of these ideas in the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, are based on, we could say, timeless Chinese philosophical principles. So, one is linking theory and practice. And we know that China, whether it's domestic policy or foreign affairs, has a top down approach, meaning that it starts with principles that become policies that create effects in the world, but that these are linked and analyzed to make sure that they all complement and work together. So I think we can understand the Global Security Initiative in this way, as well as that it comes from this Chinese tradition of principles integrated with practice. And one thing to point out here, too, I think that's very important with this is that it also recognizes human nature, in that some countries pursue foreign policy based on threats, military attacks, even assassination, as we've seen in the Middle East. Whereas I think China recognizes that people are much more likely to work with you and that there will be more durable solutions when people see something positive coming out of it. So you have to offer carrots, not just threats, military attacks, and assassinations.
Well, Wang Jin, well, security initiative is rather new. It started or it proposed by the Chinese side last year, but doesn't mean that we find a wider audience accepting such an initiative, which is a holistic approach, like when you take into consideration of interests, not only your interests but also the interests of the other party. Not only the security interests, but also probably the welfare, the economic interests of the nation?
Yes. The new initiative is a very new version, if I just use the term version, that tries to redefine the relations between the different states, no matter what the states, which the states come from, the region, or which region that states come from, or the cultural background that the states are deeply rooted. Because traditionally, when we're talking about the international relations, especially defined under some Western traditions, they always trying to define, okay, this state is much civilized, this state has a much higher standards than the other states. But then when we're talking about a new initiative, on the very, very first principle is that every state should be treated equally, and every state has the same the standards to call for the more prosperous, better living standards for its people. So that's why that China hopes to use this new initiative to develop ties with different countries in the different regions. When this kind of relations are constructed, the new kind of the version will be created. That under this very new version, that every country will develop ties with each other based upon the very positive attitudes or positive desirable motivations. And then under this very new vision, the future for the global ties or for the international relations will be based upon the win-win prospect. So everybody will benefit from this cooperation. Everybody will help these people to create more prosperous life through this kind of cooperation. So that is why I think this new vision, new initiative will be welcomed by more and more states. Its philosophies, its principles will be accepted by more and more states in the international community, because that represents the new trend. I mean, the trend that harbored by every state or the majority of the states in this world.
Professor Izadi, it's almost like a coincidence, of the Chinese security initiative and also with the reconciliation process started quite some time in the region, among the Gulf countries, among Arab countries, and between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Can we say now there's a new approach for regional countries to basically to deal with each other, security-wise or economic development-wise, and it's very different from, let's say, the practice by the United States. For example, U.S. is more focusing on siding with one party, like the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, with a military presence, with a military bases against Iran or against another country. So now it's a new paradigm, it's a new approach here.
That's true. The United States and a number of European countries are quite upset because by creating animosity among Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries in this part of the world, they were selling billions of dollars worth of weapons every year. And if there's no animosity, if there's normal relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries, then they would lose a lot of that sale that was done by this policy of divide and conquer. So the United States and Europeans are obviously the big losers. I think we need to add here that China is also benefiting from this agreement. Iran is the place that the North-South corridor is passing through. And given the hostilities of the United States against China, China needs to make sure that its linkage with outside world goes through secure corridors. And Iran's foreign policy is not going to be changed because of pressure from the United States or other countries. We cannot say that with a lot of countries in the world, the United States generally pressures countries and gets through foreign policy objectives, but not with Iran. I think it was a Chinese official some time ago said that Iran's foreign policy does not change with the call from Washington, because there are no relations between Iran and Washington and the United States. So making sure that Iran is able to provide that service for the initiatives that China has been engaging in, the security initiatives and the economic initiatives and Belt and Road projects, is important. And given where Iran is located geographically, I think Chinese leaders realize that having peace in this part of the world is going to be good for the people of this part of the world and also for the Chinese people. Mm-hmm. And that helped with making sure that this process goes through properly.
Mm-hmm. Professor Izadi, a follow-up question, what can we expect, speak of the positive implications out of this reconciliation process between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Economically, probably politically, diplomatically, or even economically, what can we expect out of this process?
We can expect peace and prosperity if the United States and some of its allies let this process go through. The only worry that I have is that the Saudis cannot resist the pressure that comes from Washington. They have been an ally of the United States for many decades. They're trying to change their foreign policy objectives and methods, and whether they're going to be successful in having an independent foreign policy after many decades is a question that I have. If they manage to resist the difficulties that they're going to face from not only the United States, but Israelis also, if they manage to survive that pressure, I think the prospects are going to be quite good. If not, they may need help from Iran and China to be able to continue with this process and making sure that the objectives of countries that are outside Asia are not going to be enforced upon the countries of this region.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, I think Professor Izadi mentioned a point, China-U.S. relationship or the role by the United States in this region. Last year, when Biden was in Saudi Arabia, he mentioned, his visit, or the one reason for his visit is to counter the influence of China in this region. Well, in this region, they are not really competing. China is focusing on the economy, the U.S. is focusing on security, but the U.S. overall policy toward China is a containment. How will that affect, the regional peace or regional development?
Well, certainly, we've seen what I think of as a paradoxical approach by the U.S. Towards these questions. So you're right that the U.S. is looking to get as many quote-unquote friends on its side to gang up against China. But at the same time, you look at President Biden, or I guess candidate Biden at the time, really insulting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So again, it seems paradoxical to me that on the one hand, they're asking countries in the Middle East to produce more oil, lower oil prices, do this, do that, to gang up on China. But at the same time, doing things that seem to make it difficult. What I want to say about this, too, that I think is very, very important, is that this rapprochement that China helped bring about can dramatically change the world geopolitically, because it can unwind the bargain that Saudi Arabia has with the U.S. to accept only the U.S. dollar for oil and in exchange for security. So if peace breaks out in the Middle East in a sustainable way, there's much less need for security. And therefore, this may accelerate some of the movements we see towards de-dollarization and greater security for many countries around the world, including Iran, from the weaponization of the global financial system. So I think this is a very, very significant potential development that we should all be paying attention to.
Professor Wang Jin, some study have said that, China used to play a minimal role with a focus on economic, investment and trade with other countries in the region. But now China is stepping up basically to play a larger international role to bring countries together to create a peace. Not only in this region, for example, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China is also reaching out to Israel and the Palestinians, and also has made a proposal for a sustainable solution for the Ukraine crisis. What do you make of that? So China is breaking from its past practice and play a big role now?
I think on the one hand, China actually changed itself a diplomatic approach, because traditionally, as you mentioned, that China's role is too minimal that maybe some observers they could ignore China's the attitudes, China's voices. I mean, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago in some regional affairs. So that, of course, China's voices are not that loud in some sensitive issues. But then in the recent years, we can hear more and more of China's voices for peace, China calls for peace, China calls for the mechanism of the dialogue and the negotiation. Of course, China's voices are much often heard. But on the other hand, I don't think China changed a lot, because from during the past decades, China's voices are consistent and is unchangeable. That is, China hopes to develop ties with mutual respect, with win-win situation, and also China hopes to change the regional crisis or the global crisis into peaceful plans or into the stable situations through the mechanism of dialogues and through the mechanism of negotiation. So that is why I say that China never changed some part of its own diplomatic principles.
Professor Wang Jin, a follow-up to what you have said about China's approach, China's diplomatic principle, how China will continue its practice. I mean, one example probably is the Chinese reach out to both Israel and the Palestine by the Chinese foreign minister, offering a hand to bridge the difference or to reach a peace settlement between the two sides. I mean, how challenging is that? This is obviously laudable gesture, but everybody understands it is very difficult.
Yes. We have to admit, at the very beginning, that the challenges for the settlement of Israel and Palestinian crisis is much bigger than the settlements or the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it is different, totally different, another sensitive issue. And the Palestinian-Israel issue is a very systematic problem that is very difficult to be settled in a very short term. But although there were so many difficulties, China still is willing to speak out our voices, and China is still willing to share our ideas about how the peace should be organized and how the peace plan should be implemented. So that shows China's attitudes and China's willingness to further to contribute to the world peace with the standards of the global power. We want to still contribute our responsibilities and efforts to help the Palestinians and the Israelis to sit down to facilitate and encourage the talks and negotiations through the very constructive way. So I think in the future, China will continue to make contributions to the world peace with our own destination, with our own determination, with our own willingness. Although there will be more and more difficulties, there will be more and more, the obstacles, but we will still continue our efforts to do so.
Well, the Chinese said, it's never too late to talk about the peace. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. See you next time. I'm Xi Jinduo.